All right, so we are recording now. Hi, everyone. I'm Eleanor Marchant. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Program in Comparative Media Law and Policy. Not here, I'm at home. But we run this great seminar series that we started last year on global media policy. And we've had a bunch of really interesting speakers. We do it in collaboration with the University of Johannesburg. We've tried to kind of get people from all over the world. The purpose is to get like a global audience for this kind of thing and not just have an Oxford-based audience who could normally come in person. For that, we're really lucky to have Victor Pickard here joining us. He is a professor at my alma mater, my PhD program from the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania. And I had him as a professor. I worked for him, so I really admire him and his work. And I think the best way to proceed is to let him, talk about his work and to just launch into the exciting presentation about media in crisis. So welcome, Victor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you for inviting me and organizing all this. And I want to thank all of our viewers and listeners as well. There's a lot going on in the world right now, so I really appreciate you aiming your attention this way for a brief moment. I do have some PowerPoint slides here that I will put up, hopefully successfully. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Let's see. Excellent. All right. So, So it is during these moments of crisis that draws our attention to not just how vitally important it is to have local media institutions, but also that these institutions are accountable to local communities, that they represent a diversity of voices, and that local communities are involved in designing their own media systems. And I think this is clearly where media policy comes in. Far too often we think of it as a fairly top-down endeavor and an elite-governed process, and unfortunately far too often it is. But certainly the way that I'm approaching it assumes that it should be a grassroots-driven process. And specifically, and what I get into in my recent book, is focusing on the problem of local journalism, arguing that the journalism crisis is a problem for public policy. Far too often we treat policy and journalism as these two separate spheres, and I'm certainly approaching it as if this artificial bifurcation should not exist. And indeed, given all these crises that are occurring right now, not just the global pandemic, but of course the uprisings that are occurring in the US right now in response to police brutality and systemic racism, it reminds us that these crises are also opportunities to try to reinvent journalism, to try to recreate our media institutions from the ground up. And that is what I was arguing in my book and continue to expand on. Now, before I get too far into it, I always come out with a couple caveats. One is that this book does focus primarily on the US media system. That's my primary case study, but the implication certainly is not that this is an ideal model. Quite the contrary. I treat the US system as a cautionary tale for what not to do, to how we should not design our media systems. So I think there are many lessons that we can learn from the mistakes that we make in the US around media policy and around supporting our journalism. And related to that, for the longest time, there was this assumption that the journalism crisis was predominantly an American problem, a US problem. And I think increasingly it's abundantly clear that many of these problems that we've been facing in the US are now global in nature for a number of reasons. But certainly with regards to the journalism crisis, it's not an American journalism crisis. There are structural reasons that I'll get into in a moment about why it hit earlier and harder in the US compared to countries around the world. But it's increasingly clear that this is a global journalism crisis and that commercial media systems around the world are facing many similar challenges. Now, having said all that, as much as I want to generalize many of the problems that we're facing in the US to social contexts around the world, there are a number of characteristics that places the American system in a category of its own. especially according to these three indices. And I refer to this as American media exceptionalism. But in many sectors, you'll find really to call them oligopolies is probably overly generous. In many cases, it's duopolies or monopolies that dominate entire sectors of our media system. And in many ways, we're under the worst of both of multiple worlds, two worlds in particular. Not only are we at the mercy of these monopolies, but these monopolies tend to be only lightly regulated. So it'd be a very different situation if there was a strong social contract, if there were a lot of give backs to the community for the many benefits that these monopolies take for granted. But I would say the most consequential characteristic in the American media system that really sets it apart from systems around the world is that it is predominantly commercialized with only very weak public alternatives. And anytime I'm making this argument, I always trot out this graph that's based on data from Rod Benson, Matt Powers, and Timothy Neff from several years ago, still pretty accurate today, that shows how the US is literally off the charts for how little we spend towards our public media system per capita per year. It comes out to about $1.40. So a cheap cup of coffee. If you throw in regional or rather state and local subsidies, you'll get that up to more like $3.40. So maybe, you know, a cappuccino. But compared to most democratic countries around the world, to give a few examples here in the UK, roughly you spend about $100 per person per year on your public broadcasting system. In Northern European countries get up to close to $200 per person per year. So why this matters is that when the market fails to support the level of journalism that democracy requires, at least in these democratic nations, you have a sort of social safety net, a public media system that can fill in some of the gaps. And in the US, you have nothing of the sort. You basically have a kind of perfect storm for a structural journalism crisis. And I should note that it's getting worse in the States. A few years ago, the leading educational program, Sesame Street, was leased off to HBO. This was one of the premier programs of our public broadcasting system that's now essentially been privatized. The Trump administration has been trying to phase out what little federal spending there is. They have not been successful yet, but generally speaking, our public broadcasting institutions have been under much attack in recent years. So again, why this matters is that the US system has been so dependent on advertising revenue in particular. It's heavily commercialized, but this usually means that it's highly dependent on advertising revenue. Our newspaper industry, to give one example, traditionally was about an 80-20 split, 80% derived from advertising revenues, 20% from reader support. This is much different from most newspaper industries around the world, which is probably the main reason why the journalism crisis hit so hard so early in the US. So the US media system is subjected to these unmitigated commercial pressures. And I also want to point out that there's this kind of lazy narrative that the internet broke journalism, but I try to show in my book that historically it's been baked into the commercial DNA of our journalism, that there have been these structural vulnerabilities, again, primarily this overdependence on advertising revenue. So it wasn't just that the internet broke journalism. We can't blame it all on Craigslist. That said, to look at the basic nuts and bolts of this local journalism crisis, many of you are aware of this, but it is true that when readers and advertisers migrated to the web, it basically destroyed this 150-year-old business model that digital advertising pays pennies to the dollar of traditional print advertising. And there's really been, aside from a few media institutions, there's been no successful model that monetizes online content enough to support the kind of journalism that we need. And this is especially true for what we might call public service journalism, local journalism, investigative journalism, international journalism. So with the collapse of the ad revenue model, there's fewer revenues, which means there are fewer journalists. Even before the pandemic struck, US newsrooms had already lost over 50% of their employees since the early 2000s. So this was already a terrible, another lazy narrative is that it's the coronavirus that's destroying local journalism, but this was already a problem well before the pandemic occurred. And again, this has been a problem here in the UK as well. They were already talking about news deserts, and since the pandemic has occurred, there's been over 40 news outlets that have ceased publication, and this is getting worse by the day. So this local journalism crisis is very pronounced here in the UK as well. So now that newspapers are declaring bankruptcy, closing down, reducing home deliveries, going online only, we have a number of concerns that rise to the fore. And again, it's also a problem that there's been virtually no public policy response thus far. So some of these concerns, these are kind of symptomatic of these deeper structural problems, kind of late stage, opportunistic pathologies. One is the rise of native advertising. That's when there's blurring in the distinction between advertising content and news content. And as problematic as that has been, what's even more troubling is what might be referred to as behavioral advertising or behavioral tracking. A study that Tim Liebert and I did a few years ago found that news websites were among the worst culprits for subjecting readers, online readers, to third parties, to data brokers and advertisers without them being aware of this hidden relationship. Now, I recently heard that the New York Times is supposedly stopping this, but up until recently, the Times was on a good day subjecting readers to 44 third parties without them being aware of this. Now, of course, many of these third parties might be innocuous, but some of them certainly are not. So this is kind of a case study of what Shoshana Zuboff refers to as surveillance capitalism. Beyond that, there's also concern about this growing casualization and precarity of journalistic labor. So not just the loss, not only fewer jobs, but lower paid jobs with fewer benefits. There's greater reliance on freelancers and stringers. And many would-be journalists are increasingly going into other professions, especially public relations. It's now about, for every one journalist, you have about 6 PR employees in the US. It's getting closer to 7. And then also there are the loss of particular kinds of public service journalism, something that I already referred to, this concern about news deserts, where you have entire regions, entire communities that have no access to any local media whatsoever. And you start hearing about these metaphors like ghost newspapers starting to come into the vernacular. My favorite is Vulture Capitalists. This is where you have private equity firms that are swooping in and buying up these distressed newspapers and then just picking over the bones, literally selling them for parts. They might start with selling off the parking lot, selling off the building, the printing press, the equipment itself, and then dumping it for a tax write-off. So why does this matter? This gets us to this last concern about the effects on political behavior and democracy. We all learn in school that democracy requires a strong media system, but what we have now is a kind of natural experiment where we're seeing what happens to a local community when their local newspaper closes down. And now almost on a weekly basis, there's a new study coming out that's showing that those lacking access to reliable news are less informed about politics, less civically engaged, less likely to vote. Without local journalists, there's also less accountability and a rise of corruption and mismanagement in local governments. And also communities are becoming increasingly polarized as they're forced to rely more on partisan-driven national news outlets. So what we've learned in school is actually true. It's empirically borne out that democracy requires a free and functional press. So this all begs the question, is there an alternative to the advertising model? Because it's been around for so long, it's often thought of as the natural order of things, and alternatives fall beyond our imagination. But over the years, we've certainly been thinking about what some of these alternatives might look like. And in a very cheerfully titled book that came out in 2011 that I did, an edited collection I did with Robert McChesney, we went out and surveyed a number of the leading journalists and media analysts and scholars on the nature of the journalism crisis. If you recall, this was the the last economic crisis that we had in 2008, 2009, sort of the early stages of this modern journalism crisis. And we wanted to find out, what's to be done? What are the alternatives here? And I don't think it was that we were all prescient or especially insightful that we came up with 4 of the top models that are still discussed today. I think rather it suggests that there actually aren't that many structural alternatives. There aren't many creative ways for paying for journalism. And most of the ideas that are out there loosely fall into these 4 buckets. The first one is always a very alternative, intuitive one. This idea that if advertising isn't supporting journalism, then why shouldn't readers pay for it? Why should they be getting this for free? So we have paywall models, or we might have various kinds of subscription models, micropayments, membership models. Unfortunately, various institutions have been doing this now for about a decade, and the evidence is very mixed on this. It really seems to support, in the US at least, only the largest newspapers, the national newspapers, for example, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. And you might find some niche outlets that rely on a membership model, but by and large, this is not a systemic fix. It's not generating enough revenue to offset the losses of the tens of billions of dollars of advertising revenue that the newspaper industry has lost in recent years. One quick point that I forgot to mention earlier, the reason why we're so concerned about newspapers is that in many cases, especially in the US, they're the last bastion for original reporting. Study after study shows that there's, even in their beleaguered state, that is the source of original reporting for the majority of Americans. And in many media ecosystems around the world, newspapers play a very key role in generating original news that's then disseminated throughout the system. So once we see that the paywall model doesn't seem to be working, another model that's often trotted out is this citizen journalism model that's reliant on crowdsourcing. We used to hear a bit more about that back in the heady days of the utopian discourses about how the internet was going to revolutionize society, it was going to democratize countries around the world. That, of course, hasn't panned out exactly as we might hope, and some of that earlier utopian enthusiasm has waned. But the idea was that, we all have these things. We can be citizen journalists. We don't have to rely on institutions or professional journalists anymore. That has begun, that discourse has faded. Another model that's still very much presented often as a top contender is this idea that foundations or philanthropists or benevolent billionaires should support the media that we need. Now, this begs the observation that not all billionaires are benevolent. Many of them come in with very distinct political agendas. But regardless, again, this isn't really a systemic fix. It shows that perhaps the benevolent billionaires will be able to save a news outlet here and there. And there are some fantastic exemplars that we can point to. I always think of ProPublica, for example, or The Intercept, or even Jeff Bezos supporting the Washington Post. These are some of the successful models, but this is not going to save newspapers across the board, especially around the local journalism crisis. So this brings us to this last model that's the least discussed, often written off as a political non-starter. Again, the public media model that I was talking about earlier, that has remained so impoverished in the US. And part of my work really tries to look at, why has this remained so verboten? Why when Americans hear that phrase, media subsidy, they drop into fetal positions. Many of them think this is antithetical to core American freedoms. But if you know our history, you know that media subsidies are as American as apple pie. If you go back from the dawn of the postal system, which was primarily a newspaper delivery infrastructure, it was heavily subsidized. We've always subsidized our media systems. Even the internet itself was a result of massive public subsidies. So in my work, and here I'm just going to note very quickly a previous book where I try to make sense of this American libertarianism. I didn't think that it was simply in the air that we breathe or the water that we drink, that there were historical reasons for why the US has such a commercialized media system, why we came to inherit this particular weird type of system that's so different from systems around the world. And I found that many roads lead back to the 1940s, where you find a moment where the US went in a very different direction compared to most democracies around the world. And it's why we ended up not only with a more commercialized media system, but it's also partly why we don't have something like the NHS in the US. It's because that in the 40s, there was a particular moment when a social democratic vision for many of our core systems was being advanced, and then suddenly you have an anti-communist hysteria that emerges where these kinds of projects were discredited, were delegitimized. And this is true for why we don't have nationalized healthcare. It's also true for why we don't have a more social democratic media system. And to reduce that entire book into one PowerPoint slide, this is the post-war, what I refer to as the post-war settlement for American media that came out of these struggles between media reformers, media institutions themselves, and regulators, basically that media would remain only lightly regulated. Now, this doesn't mean that the government isn't involved. The government's always involved in all media systems. The question is how it should be involved. And in the US, it would be involved in a way that mostly benefited a handful of media corporations, and that these corporations would practice social responsibility, but was largely defined in their own terms. And then finally, that these institutions would be protected by a negative reading of the First Amendment. The First Amendment is something that we're very proud of in the US. It crystallizes our freedom of the press, freedom of speech, does a lot of great things, but in many ways it's been interpreted in a fashion so that it's used to fend off public interest protections, so that corporations have essentially captured the First Amendment. And it's treated in a negative in the Isaiah Berlin sense, that basically it protects us freedom from government intrusion instead of freedom for example, a public or a collective right to a rich and diverse media system. That would be a positive liberty that the First Amendment also arguably could stand for, but unfortunately too often is not interpreted in that way. So this leads us, this kind of what I refer to as a corporate libertarian model, leads us to a market ontology of journalism. And that's where we see journalism not as a public service, but primarily as a commodity that's bought and sold on the market. The implication is that if journalism isn't profitable for publishers and media owners, then we should let it wither. Now imagine if this same logic were applied to our academic work. If our peer-reviewed journal articles weren't getting enough likes and clicks and shares, then we would have to do something else, or worse, we might lose our jobs. Also, if you were to apply this logic to our school, our public education system, if school children no longer wanted to learn about, as the Brits call them, maths, we say mathematics. If they don't want to learn about that anymore, then it's discontinued because there's no longer consumer support for that. So these are different ways of saying that having journalism driven by such a market logic is not beneficial for democratic society writ large. Also, this idea that the institutional collapse of journalism is beyond our control. It's something that happens to us. It's a natural disaster. It's an act of God. There's a lot of concern in the US, as there should be, about the Trump administration's actions towards the press. But if you think about what the market has been doing to the press, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's hollowing out newsrooms. I mean, it's basically doing the work of Trump, or at least doing the work that Trump wishes he could do by destroying our news institutions across the country. And finally, there's this assumption that even though the market has caused this kind of destruction, that market forces and new technologies will somehow guide us out of this predicament. Now, fortunately, and I could say much more about all of these tropes, but I will instead start moving on to the what's to be done part. Fortunately, there are political economic rationales for policy intervention. This idea that news and information are not just commodities, that they are public goods. And this means not just in the economic sense that they are non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Non-rivalrous means that one person's consumption does not detract from another person's consumption. Non-excludable means it's very difficult to prevent free riders. This is especially true in a digital environment. It's one of the reasons why paywalls don't work very well. So aside from these intrinsic qualities for why news and information are different from simple commodities, they also produce tremendous positive externalities. If you think of things like parks, light, knowledge, clean air, things of this sort that produce tremendous positive externalities that society really depends on, but the market does not support. This is another reason why, at least a rationale for why we need to subsidize news and information, why these kinds of non-market means of support are absolutely necessary. This also, for the longest time, a decade ago, I'd have to get into these heated arguments about whether journalism should be thought of as a public good. Fortunately, I don't have to make that argument as much anymore, but for many academics, they think, journalism is a public good, drop the mic. That's all, enough said, we don't have to say anything else. Well, you really have to tease that out a bit more and to show that there is what I refer to as systemic market failure, that the market's never going to support the level of journalism that democracy needs. This has historically been true, but it's especially true now. One way of putting it this, when you look historically, advertisers, this was a very convenient relationship between advertisers and media owners. Advertisers were never necessarily concerned about supporting local journalism or ensuring that there were foreign bureaus around the world. They were simply trying to reach audiences. And for well over 100 years, the best way of doing that was to advertise through a local newspaper, which had kind of a monopoly status in a local market. As soon as that relationship began to fall apart with the migration to the web, advertisers jumped ship. They had no reason to continue paying this kind of money to reach audiences when it was much more effective and, more important, is much more economical to use internet digital advertising. So finally, there's also the argument that these media failures are social problems. And again, this is a problem for public policy. So what should be done? This is where I get to the very broad argument that, in my view, there are two general steps that must be taken. One is that we need to decommercialize our media as much as possible, and then we need to democratize our media, make sure that local communities own and control these institutions, that local newsrooms look like the communities that they purportedly serve. Now, in the UK, for example, you already have a fairly decommercialized system, or at least you have the BBC, which looms large in your media system. But many people would argue that it needs to be democratized. Decommercializing it is necessary, but insufficient. I have 5 general approaches to doing this here. 3 are more top-down, 2 are more bottom-up. The idea of establishing public options, which I've already referred to, but this goes beyond just creating a public media system, a public news media system, but also we need to think about the necessary underlying infrastructure. So this would include broadband networks. In the US, we have what are called community broadband networks or municipal broadband networks. And this is something that's beginning to expand. I hope to see it's a model that proliferates in the coming years. We also need to break up and prevent monopolies from occurring. There's certainly a movement for doing that in the States right now, and I think globally, especially the platform monopolies, are beginning to receive well-deserved scrutiny. And then regulating news outlets. In the US, we used to have a thing called the Fairness Doctrine. That was thrown out in 1987. You still have impartiality rules here in the UK, but that's certainly one of the interventions that can be made, is to regulate news media. I think that's a very inherently fraught approach. Then the next 2, which are more bottom up, the idea that workers themselves should own and control. For example, journalists should govern their own newsrooms, and you're beginning to see a rise of cooperatives and collectives, and certainly this wave of unionization across the United States, and that communities themselves should own and control these organizations, these news outlets, so that basically you have multimedia hubs in communities across the country. Just a few more policy ideas here for supporting and expanding public and nonprofit media. One is this idea of leveraging already existing public infrastructure. So in the US right now, there's a battle over saving our post office system, our postal system. And I've argued that, there are these boxy post offices and communities, tens of thousands of them across the United States, that could be deployed towards community journalism. We also could be using tax laws, incentives to facilitate struggling newspapers into low profit, nonprofit models. And finally, we need to create a trust. So much of this comes back to how are we going to financially and institutionally support this massive public media system that I'm calling for. And there are actually many different ways of doing this. One of them that's beginning to gain some traction around in various countries around the world is to apply taxes to the platform monopolies, Facebook and Google. And one point that I didn't mention earlier is that not only does digital advertising revenue pay only pennies to the dollar of traditional print advertising revenue, but most of that revenue is going to the big bad duopoly of Facebook and Google. About as much as 85% of every new digital advertising dollar is going to those two firms, which provides a very compelling argument for why they should be putting money back towards journalism. Unfortunately, that too often translates to sending money back to the commercial publishers, who are also complicit in the journalism crisis. So this really shouldn't be about just supporting Rupert Murdoch, but actually putting money into a public media fund. So I do think that this growing scrutiny towards media monopolies, platform monopolies, Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, to be specific, creates this opportunity, these various crises around the pandemic, around what's happening in the US right now with social movements on the rise. I think that despite all this doom and gloom, these crises are also opportunities for us to create something entirely different. And on that positive note, I will end, and I will turn over to the Q&A. So thank you. And I will also get out of my PowerPoint.
Thank you, Victor.
Thank you.
So I thank you so much. I mean, there's a lot to think about in your presentation. And for those of you in the audience, you can submit your questions on the Q&A tab, and I will ask them. So it'll be part of the conversation. So feel free to send them. But I thought I would take advantage of my privileged position and ask you a few questions myself. I mean, I have a lot, but I think I kind of want to start from the position of like, how did we get here? Which you definitely talk about in your presentation, but like, I would love to hear more about your views about the kind of history of the privileged place that we put on free speech in the States, the constitutional right to that, and how that's gotten really co-opted as a way of sort of protecting misinformation almost at this point. So like how, and in your book, I think you talk about this real problematic role of misinformation as well. And so, I mean, how did we get from a place where free speech meant like protecting journalism, protecting the right to critique the government, to a place now where it's essentially protecting misinformation that's really problematic for democracy?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question. And I'll try to keep it short because I would love to talk about this question alone for the next 3 hours. But I mean, I think, there are a few things I'd want to tease out. So first off is that, and not that you were suggesting this, but I always want to be clear that I don't think there was this golden era of journalism that we want to go return to. I don't think it was ever that great to begin with. And there were these structural problems that have been present since the dawn of, especially the commercialization of the press in the 1800s, where you went from a partisan model to this kind of consumer-driven model, where the readers were seen less as members of a polity and more as buyers and consumers. And so that changed the logic of these news institutions. The First Amendment itself, I mean, to be fair, when it was drafted, and it's always a very fraught endeavor to try to go back to like the original intent of, the founders when they drafted up the First Amendment. But it was also clear that it wasn't just about protecting these news institutions, for sure. It was about protecting our rights. And the idea, I mean, the First Amendment itself is rendered farcical if there isn't a press system to begin with, right? So it sort of presupposes that there actually is journalism, or that there are media institutions, even if those institutions look very different back then than they do today. So if you trace out both these kind of democratic ideals and these structural problems from the early days of the commercial system, you can see this kind of these consistent. So this journalism crisis that we're dealing with today is really just the logical conclusion of these structural tensions that have been baked into the DNA of the system. And increasingly, they, as you suggest, they become further captured by this commercial logic, so that all content should flow unimpeded, and especially misinformation. Misinformation often tends to be very cheaply produced. It's not behind a paywall. Where it used to be, if it bleeds, it leads. Now it's if it's outrageous, it's contagious. This is part of the business model of Facebook, of these platform monopolies. So for these structural reasons, I think that's helped degrade.
Oh. Victor? I know, yes. Thank you, Roxanne. He's paused for some reason now.
Our journalism.
Oh, I think his Wi-Fi connection is likely. Hi, Victor, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we lost you for a little bit there. Sorry.
That's okay. I was ranting.
No, it's fine. Do you have a concluding thought on that we may have missed?
Just that these historical problems, that's why it's important to historicize these things. The journalism crisis is really a kind of logical conclusion to these early structural, long-standing problems. And also, we need to go back to some of those normative ideals to see how media are not living up to them.
Great. I have more questions, but we have a couple that have come in from the audience, so I'm going to go to theirs first. So the first is from Miguel, who said, Victor, you've said journalism should continue as a lightly regulated activity, but do you think media ownership should be more regulated in order to avoid oligopolies?
Yes, that's the short answer. I do think that we do need to see more antitrust, and breaking up some of these monopolies would be great, would help some of our problems, but it wouldn't solve all of our problems. So to go back to what I sort of ended on earlier, there's this growing movement to focus on Facebook and Google and their culpability in the journalism crisis, and try to make sure that they better distribute the advertising revenue back to the publishers. But to be honest, that really doesn't get at the core root of the problem. That's, even if they were to send more money back to the publishers, that's not going to help us with the news deserts problem necessarily. It might help a little. But so even though we do need to regulate and perhaps break up some of these monopolies, that's not going to solve all of our journalism problems. That's why I call for a public media system. I don't see any way around some of these problems. I mean, with a public media system, it's part of its mission is a universal service mandate. So that makes sure that all local communities, they don't always live up to this mission. I should be clear, but that's certainly part of the project. And I think with these news deserts that disproportionately hurt communities of color, lower socioeconomic groups, rural communities, it's gonna require a public media system to reach those communities.
So we have more questions coming in. The first one I've got is from Damien Tambini here in the UK. He says, hi, Victor, you identified a negative approach to the First Amendment as a barrier to reform. It's still there, and it is a problem for most of your solutions. How will this change? Is it a matter of bringing the US into line with global approaches? If so, how?
Yes. Thank you, Damien. And he and I have talked about this a lot, and he knows more than anyone perhaps that this is a very daunting problem. He's absolutely right that some of these issues are almost insurmountable unless we expand our notion of what's a legitimate policy intervention. And too often there's this First Amendment absolutism in the US that just throws up this barrier and says, you can't do that. The government's not allowed to do that. It's not allowed to intervene. But as I noted earlier, government's intervening all the time. It's a question of whose interests is it intervening for. Whose interest is it protecting? So I think that there is an opening here. Increasingly, we're seeing that the market's not supporting the journalism we need. These platforms, Facebook in particular, isn't supporting the journalism we need. So I think almost necessarily there is going to be a public shift towards policy interventions that will require, and in many cases, this is a discursive problem. It's not a legal problem. There's actually jurisprudence in the US. It shows that actually the government can intervene here, can subsidize media, can break up media monopolies. For example, the 1945 Associated Press decision by the Supreme Court is one example, but there are others. So, but it's going to be a very big long-term project and won't happen tomorrow for sure.
Great. Okay, so I have a question from Kira, who's a fellow postdoc of mine in Oxford here, and she's wondering if you can talk a bit more about what's different or unique about the rise of platform journalism. So how does it differ in meaningful ways from the private corporate ownership of news organizations, you know, those which have always been a feature of journalism in the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not necessarily an area of expertise of mine. Doesn't mean I won't talk to it. But I mean, when I think of platform, I guess I would want to know exactly what you mean by platform journalism. But for example, that's one of the main problems is that Facebook does not do original journalism, right? That's the Facebook. It's not Facebook's content that it's profiting from. So not only is it taking the lion's share of the advertising revenue that's generated by this content, but it's relying on those news media producers. So I guess we need to be clear that those old-fashioned, traditional, professional journalists are still the backbone of this media ecosystem, and we need to make sure that they're actually able to produce work. And we need to make sure there's ways to support them financially and institutionally. So I don't know if that gets to the question, but I do think that's a problem. This idea of platform journalism is almost a misnomer because the platforms aren't doing journalism.
I have a sort of a question that kind of builds on that, so I'm gonna just add that before I get to the other questions. Which is, you know, in your book, you talk a bit about how to financially support this sort of public journalism that you're advocating for. One of the options is to have, you know, companies like Google and Facebook that are really benefiting from the new model to, you know, fund a trust that would kind of blindly support, you know, that would support this public journalism. And, you know, I was thinking a bit about this idea, and I mean, I think it's a potentially great solution. Wowever, you know, those companies are also disrupting journalism all over the world, right? So, you know, to what extent would they have an obligation to do something similar in other countries where they're also upending the traditional media environments?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, and I mean, even though a lot of my focus is on the U.S. situation, there are some very compelling proposals out there that I support. In fact, I've written in support of this, that it should be a global public media fund. So it's not just focused on national public media systems, but there needs to be a global fund that can support investigative journalism, especially in countries that are undergoing, you know, various political and social upheaval. So absolutely, there's no reason why this couldn't or shouldn't be a global public media fund as well, and that Google and Facebook should be funding it.
Yeah, okay, I think that's a great idea. Okay, I will go to some of these other questions. We have one from Monroe. Yay, hi Monroe. He's asking, are we moving towards an international propaganda model of journalism? So thinking like Russia Today, Chinese networks writ large. So, you know, the creation of, let's see, what is he, creating the perception of a US response. So not only internationally, but domestically. So I think is the model as it is really leading to kind of the commercial model, that it is really leading to more of a propaganda style journalism rather than public interest one?
Yes, I do think so. I mean, it's not like the commercial imperatives are necessarily in cahoots with these, various nefarious forces, whatever, whomever they may be. But because the commercial logic has weakened our media systems around the world, it has created these vulnerabilities. It's created vacuums. If for no other reason, when you have media institutions that are always hungry for content, they rely on the constant circulation of new and cheaply produced content. It creates these opportunities for propagandists of all stripes to take advantage of that. And you're seeing it on a more local level. You're seeing that in the US, where especially right-wing groups have been adopting what sound like very legitimate names of news outlets, basically to basically disseminate far-right political messages. So, and you're seeing versions of that around the world. So absolutely, thank you, Monroe. That's a very good question. It's another reason why we should all be very freaked out about this.
So this, I think, is a little bit linked in the sense of, government propaganda through media. I know there's some critique of this idea of a public interest, public journalism as a concern that it will be a government mouthpiece, essentially. And so we have a question from Rasha Abdullah, who has, she's asking, particularly in countries where government intervention, would mean censorship and more disinformation, how do you kind of resolve that issue? And I think Rasha, you say that in other countries, but we have a very real concern about that in the States at the moment, I think, too.
Absolutely. Again, it's a global problem, but it's true that it's especially pronounced in non-democratic nations. And it's very hard to, basically you wouldn't want a public media system in some countries where it clearly would become simply a mouthpiece of the state. And that is always a vulnerability with this kind of model. And this concern always comes up, as it should, in these discussions. There are structural safeguards that can be put into place. And as imperfect as it is, the BBC has tried to do that. I think it needs structural reform to make that work better. But many democratic countries around the world have figured out how to create these firewalls. And just to say that the government has an affirmative duty to fund this system, to create that public media trust, it should always have no control over actual editorial decisions. And I do flesh out some of those, a little bit of what that would look like in my book about how power needs to be devolved to the states, to local communities. There needs to be independent advisory boards. So there are ways to make sure that the money's allocated in a way that's decided by local communities. I keep harping on this, but I think it's so important that these media systems are built according to the terms of local communities, that they are involved in every stage of governance and media production. And that's what I mean by not just decommercializing, but democratizing it as well. Yes.
So this, I think Admire has a question, which you maybe answered a certain amount of this already, which is to do with the mechanics of, taxing platform companies to help fund community media and public service media. I mean, is there more detail that you want to give about like how that would specifically happen, or should we just tell them to read your book?
Oh, right. That's always a very tempting response. But no, I won't simply say read the book. I hope you do. But also I don't get into all the details in the book either. Partly because a lot of this is being hashed out as we speak. Countries around the world right now are grappling with these problems, grappling with how do we subsidize news outlets? How do we determine who is a journalist? What is a news outlet? These are thorny, messy questions, but they're absolutely essential discussions that we all need to be having. And so one of those questions is, how should the platforms be doing this? And as I noted, too often it means just simply redistributing money back to the Rupert Murdochs of the world. And I think that if it's not, we could put into place like the criterion that these news outlets have to be non-commercial and have to be independent. But at the very least, we should weight it towards smaller independent local outlets. And that's one of the reasons, the Canadian government has been trying to subsidize local journalism there.
Mm.
They've been criticized because a lot of that money is going back to the incumbent publishers to the detriment of small local nonprofits. Even what the BBC has done that I think is very admirable, the Local Democracy Reporters program, where they just sent 150 reporters to news outlets across the country to focus on local journalism. That's awesome. But those publishers are the ones that also helped exacerbate the journalism crisis by defunding their own journalism. So we want to make sure that we're not socializing costs and privatizing profits. But I think these are fixable, these are doable things. These are fixable problems. So we just need to keep talking about it. And the last thing I'll say, one of the reasons why I don't get into all the details is that some of these details should be left open necessarily so that local communities can determine for themselves what these newsrooms and what these news institutions should look like. So I think we need to build in a little bit of ambiguity there, because some of this should not be determined by preconceived formula, but instead needs to be borne out through conversations by local community members themselves.
Yeah, this sort of topic talks a bit about like who is a journalist, who's like able to, or who's a media professional in some ways. And this, actually touches on another question we have from Ray, who's pointing out that in like a new media context, it's not only professional news institutions and people that are media. So this sort of touches a bit on your citizen journalism kind of point. But they're asking, how will this influence the understanding of free speech and the regulation of the media? So they're especially concerned about when hate speech becomes more of a serious problem.
Yeah, and I do. And again, because we have this kind of First Amendment absolutism in the US, it's very hard to regulate against hate speech, harmful speech. In my view, it should be regulated, that it does kind of violence, especially to vulnerable communities. But beyond that, so much emphasis is on freedom of expression, freedom of speech. And this is where we need to get also into those kind of positive liberties, where we need to make sure this is about human flourishing, human, opportunities for human expression, not just shielding us from government regulation. So yeah, I think this does go back to this idea that we need to expand some of our most basic principles about like, what does freedom mean? What is, in a media system, what should media freedom look like? And too often that's been dictated from up on high. And I think we need a more organic grassroots process involved with these questions.
Yeah, there's, we have a lot of questions, by the way, everybody. There's lots of questions coming in, so be patient with me. I will try to get to all of them. There are quite a few, that touch on, the role of new media, of course. And there's quite an interesting question from Roxana, who's asking about how, journalism in part is suffering now because of the internet, though of course you talk about it being more of an institutional issue because of the commercial nature of it as well. But she, because of this role of the internet, she's wondering about what your thoughts are on regulating algorithms that pertain to information access and media reporting.
Yeah, and that's something, it's like, I mention it in, I think, the conclusion of my book. But I also think of the conclusion of my book as sort of the seedbed for ideas that I'm going to take into the next book, the next book project. Great. So I am working on that right now, but I don't have a lot to say about it at the moment, beyond saying that I do think there's a role for creating what might be thought of as public interest algorithms. So for example, it might be inconceivable to create a public alternative to Facebook, as much as I would like for us to do that. But there's network effects and path dependencies that's going to make that very difficult. However, we could try to boost public interest content within, for example, Facebook news feeds. And that could be done algorithmically. We could make sure that Google privileges reliable information. Now, again, who's going to determine what's reliable? There's going to be thorny questions. But so long way of saying, yes, I think there's a role for for regulating algorithms to try to create a better and stronger media system.
This so actually there's a question from Giovanni who really relates to this same idea about social media content and public kind of in some way control over that sort of thing. So he's asking about should we be focusing on the transparency and accountability of these social media moderating, like content moderation systems? So specifically in the sense of the procedures that are done, like algorithms, that sort of thing, as opposed to talking specifically about the content, but rather like what are the mechanisms through which social media content is regulated in a public interest way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really like that approach. I think it is important, and we can't imagine that. I mean, Facebook is already doing that. They're not very transparent about how they're designing their algorithms, but we know that they can privilege particular kinds of content over others. Google does the same thing. This is particularly like anytime there's a mass shooting in the US, which tragically happens far too often, people will go to Google, and oftentimes it'll be conspiracy sites that are the first links that you see with a search. So that's just one example of where we could have regulations that entailed, that mandated that, for example, public media rose to the fore, but that still doesn't get to this supply side problem of, even if we had great platform regulation, even if we were able to regulate against all these online social harms like hate speech, it doesn't solve the problem of not having a supply of reliable news and information. It doesn't get to the news deserts problem, the local journalism crisis. So that's why so much of my focus is on that. But I agree with all these points that this is all, we should see this holistically. These things all need to be done simultaneously.
Which is, I mean, it's a huge challenge, right? Because we're talking about needing to do these things at the national level, at the international level, to create kind of those international norms, but also very much at these local kind of levels. And I mean, I think, I've been thinking a lot about this in regards to the protests and everything at the moment, and how important the local accountability is. So the role of having a particularly locally responsive to the community kind of journalism seems especially important in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I completely agree.
I mean, is there like, okay, I've got too many other people's questions to co-opt it here, but I'll go. Actually, we have a question from Monroe that I think is quite was especially topical, because he's asking about the new executive order that Trump signed, which is in relation to Twitter censoring his post. And do you see, he's asking, do you see this order as a step in that direction? I guess I'm trying to think in what this was probably in reference to something we were talking about earlier, but do you see it as opening the door to a way to discuss how platforms are talking about, or how we're looking at the platforms and their responsibility to these things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very hesitant to say that Trump has opened a door for us, but I certainly wouldn't put that spin on it. But, I mean, if I could divert the question just a little bit, because I haven't studied the executive order closely, but everything I've read about it, it sounds absurd. That basically Trump does not have the legal power to intervene in the way that he thinks he can. But all that said, all this added scrutiny, there is this rare bipartisan consensus in the US right now from Republicans and Democrats that these platforms have too much power. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, for very different reasons, they are coming to the same table to talk about how can we regulate them. Now who knows how that's going to turn out, and it very well could turn out in a very bad way. But I do think it's a discursive opportunity for us, even to think, a few years ago, you would have never dared to imagine that we would be talking seriously about regulating some of these firms. And now that's very much on the table. So I do think there are discursive opportunities, and certainly we being, democracy loving, and in my case, I'll say, a progressive intellectual who wants to remake our media system, I think these are discursive opportunities that we should exploit.
Mm. Yes, I will see where it goes, I guess, in this time. I mean, I'm certainly not eager for there to be executive orders that dictate the direction of these kinds of things. But yeah, I mean, at the moment, the response to his order has been fascinating, because generally people are sort of siding with at least the media that I consume are siding with the social media networks, right? Because they should be, because what Trump is saying is so problematic, they should be censoring him. But is that really the right, is that really the right course of action, to have those outlets censor political speech? It's a complicated issue at the moment. We have more questions, so I'll
Sure.
sort of divert to that. And I'm just going to read this one out because I think it's worded in a particular way that will help. So this is from Steve Jones. He says, "Hi, Victor, thanks for the talk. Well done. I'd like to hear your thoughts about whether there is a public redefinition of journalism, and particularly the term news, taking place in the US right now, and what the consequences of such a redefinition might be. Another way to put it is, has what people mean when they talk about the news changed, and how might that matter with regard to journalism as a practice as well as institution?"
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And that's another one we could spend hours talking about. But I do think that these crises have forced us to reimagine what journalism could and should look like. And part of that is how journalism is connected to local community. And we're seeing that in real time during these protest events, where you can see the difference between journalists who are really trying to connect with the protesters and with local communities, and with especially African Americans who've had such violence done to them structurally for so long. That I think that we're beginning to see it, as I sort of hinted at earlier, less as a commodity, something that we pay for, more as a service or a vital function of the community. And I think that's another discursive opportunity where we can imagine how communities organize their own newsrooms. I mean, this was the indie media ideal back in the global justice, way back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And that's when I first got involved in media activism. And that very much inspires my imagination for thinking about, what could these newsrooms look like? And those were citizen journalism, like community news outlets. And I think that's possible. We didn't have it structurally figured out at that time, and it was too dependent on the internet. But I think that that's a kind of, so I'm not sure if I'm really answering Steve's original question, but I do think there is this redefinition. That's sort of the exciting part right now that gives me hope, is that with these old institutions dying, we can create something entirely new from the ashes. And I think our definitions are going to be very different. They have to be very different. But again, that needs to be born out of these. It's not just scholars, sitting around figuring out how are we going to, operationalize these things, but really it needs to be determined by local communities themselves about how these institutions should be designed.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question that's really about like the solution you're proposing around public interest journalism and the potential for fatigue from the public in supporting something like that. So Colleen is asking, do you see a situation where public service media can claw back some of advertising dollars from the platforms such as Facebook? So I ask this in the context that public cannot sustain public media 100%. Do we not run the risk of public getting fatigued supporting media when there are other pressing issues?
Yes, excellent question. So we've pretty much hit on the three main questions that always come up about the viability of creating a new public media system. How do we pay for it? How do we make sure it remains independent? Also, how do we make sure that people go to it? We can't just build it and people will come. We more or less hit on a lot of those questions. But going back to this idea of making sure that the platforms pay for it, and I absolutely agree, we can't assume that individuals, again, this is often an American problem, that everything gets individualized. So it's about individuals paying for it. And that's why paywalls aren't working. Even membership models have been fairly limited. It's why people do feel fatigue around, when your local NPR station is doing yet another pledge drive. And that never generates enough money to support all their operations, right? So that's the reason why we need to take it outside of, it's not only a public good, but it's a merit good, and which is a particular kind of public good, but it also means that individuals are either unwilling or unable to pay for the journalism that they need. It's another reason why most countries have national healthcare systems. They don't leave it up to individuals paying for it. So as far as I see the platforms as just being one revenue stream into this public media fund that then will be allocated democratically to communities across the country and around the world. And going back to the idea of a global media fund, the folks at Illuminate that are based here in the UK, they have a great proposal that they've been commissioning for what a international public media fund might look like. Free Press is an institution in the US that's looked at a US model and basically taxes digital advertising, which is a kind of an elegant way of you're not necessarily only taxing the duopoly, although you pretty much are, but it's kind of like a sin tax or a carbon tax, on this kind of negative externality of digital advertising. So there are different mechanisms that we can set up so that money is being generated. But I keep coming back to this idea because it gets lost in the conversation that it shouldn't just go back to the commercial outlets. It should be going into a public media fund. I think that's absolutely essential.
Okay, so I have, talking about the role of journalism at the local level, and I kind of want to talk a little bit more about the protest situation. And I was thinking a bit about this with the video of George Floyd that circulated. And I mean, that was a citizen done video, right? It was circulated on social media. It would obviously made the rounds on traditional media as well. But I mean, it's hard to say, but do you think like there's something about that video being kind of a individual citizen done video of this thing that led to it having such a visceral reaction, I think, to the public? And I mean, is that something that, that journalism can't do anymore, can't have that same kind of effect in terms of like starting social movements potentially to have the real like intense impact that kind of image does?
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring that up because it's such an important point to note. And it may have seemed like I was being, dismissive earlier of the citizen journalism model as being, one of the alternatives to the dying advertising revenue model. But there's always going to be a need for those kinds of, you might call them acts of journalism. So it's just like, we are walking down the street and we capture some horrific event like that. And I think that is obviously entirely legitimate and invaluable. So we need to embrace that and celebrate it when it happens and recognize its importance. But at the same time, we have to recognize that we still need institutionally supported, financially supported, sometimes we feel uncomfortable using this word professional, but we need journalists who can make a livelihood, whose job it is to be on a particular beat day in and day out. And many of the problems that we're seeing explode right now, I think, at least indirectly, are related to failure of journalism. Like the reason, if we had a truly functional, healthy media system right now, we would be talking about global warming every day, every night. We would be talking about systemic racism every day and every night. Journalists would be doing this work constantly. And that's another distinction that we have to make. Like during these protest moments, these events, there's wonderful citizen journalism, but it's the boring days, the days where nothing's happening. We still need journalists on the street, on their beats, covering City Hall, covering the police department, covering, so there's still this essential need to have that kind of institutionally supported journalism, while at the same time, those acts of journalism are also absolutely necessary as well.
That's a really great point. I think that, in some ways they work together, right? But it has to, the challenge sometimes to me is that kind of important information that people need to know, gets drowned out by the noise of the entertainment content, obviously the kind of horse race coverage of politics, that sort of thing. I mean, is there, I don't know if you can answer this, but is there a way you get the public to pay attention to that kind of content amidst all of this?
Yeah, I mean, right, and that goes back to a couple of the earlier questions, and also the question of like fatigue, like how do we make sure the public
Yeah.
supports it? And again, I think as much as we can, we need to take those decisions. We need to just make them kind of automatic, like it's kind of like supporting your local public school, like
Yes.
try to have it built in and structurally safeguarded and this sort of permanent support for it, so that you aren't constantly coming back to people begging for more support. But I do think, I mean, what these crises have done, drawing attention to the essential need of local journalism. There's also polling data to show that across in communities across the country, across the political spectrum, there's still a trust in local journalism, even among conservatives who might hate the media, whatever that, the liberal media. When you mention their local broadcaster, their local newspaper, there's often warm, fuzzy feelings about that. And so I think that's another potential where, I do think people care about their local journalism. They typically care about their local newspaper. They care when their local newspaper dies. We have lots of evidence showing that. There's often this like outpouring of community support, but it's often too late to save the newspaper. So I don't know. Those aren't concrete answers. I mean, in some ways, we won't have the data until we start trying more of these experiments, right? So some of it is necessarily, almost faith-based. But I do think that that if we organize communities around these initiatives, they will care. They will, if they're involved, if they're invested in their own local media, they're going to trust it. They're going to go to it. They're going to use it. So that's the theory. Now we have to test it.
Yeah. It strikes me that now is perhaps an oddly good time to have that conversation about the importance of local journalism, especially because, I mean, with the coronavirus situation, I think, people are, I mean, obviously everyone's experience is different, but a lot of people have been staying at home, realizing that local businesses are in jeopardy and very fragile, realizing that, oh, maybe I should be like supporting my local business, or I'll order from local farmers market type things instead of from a big grocery store. There, at least like in the UK, among people I know, as well as in the States, there seems to be this sort of renewed interest in, returning to the local consciousness. And so it's just a thought. I don't know. Feel free to respond if you want, but
yeah. I totally agree, and I'm glad something that I had meant to mention earlier. I do think during this pandemic, that also has really raised awareness, because there was polling data. Like Pew did a study not too long before the pandemic and found that actually most people weren't aware that journalism was in crisis, that local journalism was in crisis. Which for academics, like it's almost become a boring topic. Like it's been in crisis forever. Stop talking about it, but the fact is, like most people weren't aware of this, and they certainly weren't aware of kind of the structural nature of this journalism crisis.
Yeah.
But it does show that during the pandemic, there was another the Knight Foundation teamed up with another news organization, did another survey, and found that Americans were comfortable with subsidizing their local journalism. So that was a pretty interesting data point. So I think it does show that there is this opportunity now. And even looking at what our policymakers are doing, it's become another bipartisan consensus point. Even Republican senators have been saying that we should be treating journalists as an essential service, and we need to fund them. My only concern is that all the emphasis is on the short-term emergency funding instead of the long-term, how are we going to restructure this? How are we going to make sure it's permanent? Because these problems aren't going away. There needs to be a post-pandemic vision for journalism as well.
That's equally true for medical care, right? There's a lot of emphasis on the emergency response and needs for funding medical care, but that there is a systemic change that needs to happen there as well. So we're getting close on time here. I have two more questions that I want to see if we can sneak in there before we wrap up. So one is from Kira, who's asking about why we hear so much about misinformation and disinformation these days. with at the same time much less focus on grassroots alternative publications and the flourishing of independent publications, which was the perhaps overly optimistic narrative at the start of the digital revolution, right? There was really this, belief that independent opinions were going to come out in the digital era. She's asking, is it because those alt publications actually haven't appeared or flourished as we expected? Or is it about a funding power issue? So, or is it perhaps compulsive human addiction to focusing on the negative over the positive?
Wow, this is a great question. I agree with all those points. It's all kind of all the above, but I will try. I mean, I think it's another example of where, these small independent outlets play such an outsized role, such a vital role in our larger media ecosystem. And I would never want to minimize their importance. And I think of just a few that are, there are all these new outlets, or actually aren't even that new, but are newly discovered for more people, like Unicorn Riot, which is this collective in Minneapolis. It was just doing amazing work during the early stages of the protests there. But if you look at some of what are sometimes called the little magazines, like Jacobin, N+1, they play a major role in the broader political discourse. And then you have older, like The Nation, that's been around for well over 100 years. So those alternative, whatever, we always have to fight over what do we mean by alternative. They play such a vital role, and yet I think we simultaneously need to acknowledge that that's not enough. That's not systemic. It's not going to reach broad swath. I mean, we wanted to reach broader people, but that's not going to solve the news deserts problem. That's not, we still need these kind of traditional rank and file journalists covering, state legislatures and things of that nature that alternative outlets aren't likely to cover. So we need all of them. But I agree the emphasis on misinformation and disinformation sometimes becomes a little bit overemphasized. These are very real concerns, especially around elections. I think it's a huge problem, but it's a structural problem. And sometimes we're not really getting at those structural roots. And part of that is not looking at having actual journalism, having like good information out there as well, instead of constantly being in fear of the disinformation and the propaganda that are swirling around as well.
We have a comment now, more of a comment than a question, but you should certainly be able to respond to it. From Danilo Janic, apologies if I have mispronounced your name. They say it's always good to hear, Victor. So yes, the trust in local media is high, but as that space becomes more consolidated, as is happening for local TV in the US, the commodification of news will increase. Local pictures of protests that run constantly don't inform, they just bring viewers.
Yeah, Danilo knows I totally agree with him, and he's absolutely right. I'm glad he's bringing that point up. I mean, that's another, there's so much concern about Facebook and Google, but there are other kinds of monopolies out there that were, sort of older monopolies that we used to care more about, whether we're talking about internet service monopolies or we're talking about these old news monopolies, like what Sinclair Broadcasting was doing. And we just recently saw another thing where it was an Amazon video news release just got repeated, verbatim through all these local news outlets. And it's so insidious because there's no transparency. No one knows that that propaganda is being, incubated elsewhere and dropped in from these, from some mysterious source. So that's a long way of saying that those are problems. And that's an example of where actual local journalism is being wiped out by this kind of, I don't want to say fake news, fake journalism, but it's being wiped out by this kind of cookie cutter content that's being driven by these corporate overlords, if you want to call them that. And so yeah, that's another problem. But I think again, these kind of structural interventions that I'm talking about would hopefully get at some of that, to make sure that newsrooms are liberated from those media conglomerates and actually created by local communities. I think that's one way of approaching it.
Yeah. In the wrapping up here, we have a final kind of comment question from Monroe, where he's asking about this is sort of something that you've alluded to a little bit, is the idea that maybe right now there is a bit of a natural experiment happening. This idea that with these different crises that are happening, like the protest movement, et cetera, what kind of local journalism, like the one in Minneapolis, I think you mentioned it, what kind of ones are arising? Like, to what extent are they tied to content that's, coming out of CNN? And, to what extent are they then becoming the ones that are the local experts and kind of controlling that type of information? And then, he has a bigger question about will the enduring aspects of these events ultimately affect the kind of future of the news ecology? Which is a big question.
It's a big question. It's a great question. I'd say, first of all, it's too early to tell, obviously. Yeah. It's just, I agree, these are wonderful natural experiments. It's going to keep scholars busy for many years, I think. A lot of these crises, we have a lot of work to do, a lot of things to look at more closely. But I do think, I mentioned the indie media model earlier, and that is one historical case study that we could look to give us some clue as to how this might play out. And there, you very much saw it happen that way, where with each new manifestation, with each new protest and uprising, there was an indie media news outlet that emerged organically, often based on very anarchic organizing principles. And many of them flourished for some time. Most of them were not sustainable, beyond the global justice movement. So they were very much tied up with these social movements. They were kind of like, you might call it, you think of it as like movement media, movement journalism. And I think that's unfortunate, because ideally we would create lasting institutions. On the other hand, the Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center is still flourishing in downtown Urbana. I just wrote about it recently, and it's become kind of a community media center. So it is possible, and it's true that in the early stages of these protests, those outlets tend to drive content even on the CNNs and the more mainstream outlets. So it does at least temporarily change the media ecosystem, but how permanent that is questionable. And I would like to see it become more permanent, but that's going to require financial institutional support. So that comes back to these policy questions, and maybe that's a good point to end. These are policy problems, so we need to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah. Yes. Maybe I can just ask at the very, very end, as part of the wrapping up, like, if it's a policy issue, how do we change things if there is a government that's not at all conducive to that kind of change?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these changes wouldn't happen in the States, at least, until we're in a post-Trump era, which hopefully will happen sooner than later. But even now, even during these dark times, there are still things that can be done at the local level, the state level. I have to make this mistake too when I think of policy. I think of like federal or even global levels, but thinking in terms. So, for example, New Jersey, with their civic information consortium, where they're funding local journalism. I mean, there are progressive initiatives that we could try, at least in some states across the country, and this would also include broadband initiatives. Municipal broadband projects can be done at the city level, at the small town level. So there's still things that we can do even now. But I agree, but also I'm thinking policy writ large, like it's maybe a better way of saying it is that it's a democracy problem, right? It's a local community problem. And so I do think that we could see, and certainly again, history can give us some hope here, that these social movements, these moments of social unrest can yield democratic outcomes. It's not preordained. It certainly could end up in other, less admirable places. But I think we could hope that this could lead to democratization, and that, again, the crisis is an opportunity to completely reimagine and reinvent what our news and information should look like.
So I think that is a great note to end on too. This sort of view that in a crisis that there is a possibility, like it obviously can go in a problematic direction and we have to work to prevent that, but like there is a possibility to kind of, you know, birth some kind of important change. So trying to keep open to that kind of possibility is important right now. Yeah, so I guess I just want to say thank you. If you have, do you have any last words that you want to give before we wrap it up?
No, I mean, I just want to thank you for hosting me, and thank everyone for their amazing questions. It's always afterwards I think of other things that I wish I had said. So please keep the conversation going, and feel free to reach out to me. I'm very easy to find online. I'm on social media far too often. So please track me down, and let's keep talking about the stuff.
Right. Yeah. And I'm so pleased that you were willing to come and do this with us virtually. It's been great. It's also nice to see you again. Thank you everybody else for joining us. I think that it's been a really stimulating conversation. Thank you so much for all of the questions. I appreciate your engagement. And yeah, so stay tuned. We always have more of these seminars coming up. So yeah, hope to see you guys at a future one. Have a good afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Bye.